All right, let's talk about one of the greatest nightmares the Imperium has ever faced. A threat so massive, so overwhelming, that it shattered the very foundation of humanity's rule over the galaxy. You've heard of powerful Ork Warlords before, Gazkul, Tuska, even the beast Snagas of modern 40K. But none of them, not a single one, ever came close to what this monster achieved. The beast wasn't just another warlord with a few million boys at his back. This was something else entirely, an orc so vast, so cunning, so terrifyingly organized that he brought the Imperium to its knees. He didn't just lead a war. He created an empire, a war machine so titanic that it defied everything the Imperium thought it knew about orcs. And the scariest part? Humanity never saw it coming. They were blind, complacent, thinking that orcs were nothing more than an endless tide of green-skinned barbarians incapable of true strategy. But the beast shattered that illusion. He didn't just wage war, he conquered. He built. He outmaneuvered the greatest tacticians of the Imperium. He nearly did the unthinkable. He almost wiped out humanity's rule over the galaxy. So how did it happen? How did a single orc rise to such power? And how close did the Imperium really come to total annihilation? To understand this, we need to go back to where it all began, to the rise of the beast. The origins of the beast are shrouded in mystery, and that alone should terrify anyone who understands how orcs work. Usually, when an orc warlord rises to prominence, there's some kind of story behind him, a long, bloody trail of conquest, a famous rival he crushed, a brutal war that forged him into a true monster. But the beast? He just appeared. One day, the Orc Empire he ruled was just another distant problem in the galaxy, and the next, it was a war machine unlike anything the Imperium had ever seen. That's what makes this whole story so terrifying. Nobody saw it coming. For centuries, orcs had been a constant, but manageable problem for the Imperium. Every sector had its share of green-skinned hordes, but none of them were ever truly united. They were violent, crude, and endless, sure, but they fought as much among themselves as they did against the rest of the galaxy. And then, suddenly, the orcs changed. Seemingly overnight, a massive structured and coordinated empire of orcs emerged, stretching across multiple star systems, operating on a level that was unheard of. The Imperium had spent millennia believing orcs were too chaotic and too simple-minded to truly unify under one banner. But the beast proved them wrong. The real question is, how did no one notice? How did an empire the size of this one grow in the shadows of the galaxy without the Imperium realizing what was happening? That's where theories start to swirl. Some believe the beast had been growing his power for centuries, deep in the void, beyond the reach of the Imperium's watchful eyes. Others argue that he wasn't just a product of natural orc evolution, but something more, perhaps a war boss touched by the sheer power of Gork and Mork in a way no other orc had ever been. The orcs have always had a strange, reality-bending connection to the warp, and some fans speculate that the beast wasn't just an exceptionally powerful orc, but the closest thing their race has ever had to a demigod in the material universe. Another theory suggests that the beast's empire wasn't built in isolation, but in secrecy. Orcs don't just appear out of nowhere. They need conflict, bloodshed, and sheer momentum to grow. So where did all this happen? Some believe entire regions of the galaxy had already fallen to his forces long before the Imperium took notice. Planets that had gone silent, frontier worlds that had simply vanished from Imperial records. Maybe they weren't lost to warp storms or Tyrannid incursions. Maybe they had been swallowed whole by the beast's rising dominion. But the most terrifying theory, the Imperium saw the signs and ignored them. There's a growing belief that warnings were sent, that scouts and rogue traders stumbled across something massive, something unnatural brewing in the void, and that the Imperium's bureaucracy simply failed to act. It wouldn't be the first time. Between political stagnation, endless bureaucratic red tape, and the arrogance of thinking orcs could never be a true threat, it's entirely possible that by the time the Imperium finally realized what was happening, it was already too late. One way or another, the beast didn't just arrive. He erupted onto the galactic stage with all the force of a war god. By the time the Imperium truly understood what they were facing, his forces had already spread across entire sectors, his war engines were primed, and his Wah was poised to do something no orc had ever done before. And the worst part, the Imperium still didn't grasp the scale of what was about to happen. When people talk about orc invasions, they usually picture a horde, millions of green-skinned lunatics swarming across battlefields, howling in broken Gothic and throwing themselves at Imperial defenses with reckless abandon. That's what the Imperium was used to. That's what they thought orcs were. But the beast? His forces weren't just a horde. They were an empire, a structured, disciplined, and terrifyingly advanced war machine that dwarfed anything humanity had ever faced. The numbers alone are almost impossible to comprehend. We're not talking about a single Wah launching a planetary assault. We're talking about an orc civilization spanning countless star systems, pumping out warships on an industrial scale, creating weapons that rivaled the Imperium's own, and most disturbingly, doing all of this with a level of organization that should have been impossible for orcs. This wasn't just some spontaneous warlord leading a random surge of orc aggression. This was a planned, structured campaign of conquest. Think about it. When has any orc force ever been this unified? Even the greatest orc warlords of history struggled to keep their own boys in check, let alone maintain a stable empire. Orcs aren't supposed to be builders. They're not supposed to be long-term planners. They live for the fight, for the thrill of combat, and they thrive in chaos. But under the beast, they built, they organized, they coordinated their efforts on a scale that should have been beyond them. And the warships. My emperor, the warships. The Imperium was used to orc vessels being crude, ramshackle monstrosities, barely functional slabs of metal and guns, held together more by orc belief than actual engineering. But the fleets of the beast were different. These ships were massive, powerful, and horrifyingly well-constructed. They bristled with weaponry, boasted shields that could withstand even the heaviest Imperial fire, and worst of all, they were deployed in actual strategic formations. The orcs weren't just throwing ships at the Imperium in suicidal numbers. They were fighting with tactics. So how did he do it? How did the beast build an orc empire that defied everything the galaxy thought it knew about his kind? Some believe he wasn't just a war boss, but something more. A prime orc, the ultimate evolutionary peak of his species, a being so dominant that lesser orcs couldn't help but fall in line. There's a theory that orcs, in the right conditions, can evolve to match the challenges of the galaxy, and the beast was proof of that. He wasn't just the biggest orc, he was the first true orc emperor, but even that doesn't explain everything. How did he maintain order? How did orcs, a race driven by anarchy and infighting, suddenly act as if they had a singular purpose? This is where the warp comes into play. Orcs have an innate psychic field that influences reality itself. The stronger and more numerous they are, the more their collective will bends the rules of physics. Some fans speculate that the beast's sheer presence amplified this effect to unprecedented levels. His will became law. His commands weren't just followed because he was the strongest, but because his very existence made the orcs under him more disciplined, more focused. There's another, darker theory that's been floating around, one that suggests the beast might not have been the first of his kind. Some believe that orcs were meant to become something like this long ago, perhaps even during the ancient war in heaven. That maybe, just maybe, the beast wasn't an anomaly, but a return to what orcs were always meant to be. A true cosmic force of destruction, not just a horde of marauding brutes, but a species capable of galactic domination. No matter what the truth is, one thing is undeniable. The Imperium had never faced an orc force like this before. It wasn't just about raw numbers, though there were trillions of them. It wasn't just about firepower, though they had weapons that could crack planets open. It was about the fact that, for the first time in history, orcs weren't just fighting a war. They were waging a campaign, a structured, organized, and methodical extermination of humanity. And the Imperium? They had no idea how to stop it. The first strikes of the beasts' weren't just brutal. They were calculated, methodical, and devastating in a way the Imperium had never seen before. When orcs attack, they usually hit like a storm, fast, overwhelming, and chaotic. But this was something entirely different. The initial assaults were too precise, too well planned. The beast wasn't just throwing his hordes at humanity to see what stuck. He was making a statement. It started in the outer sectors, on the fringes of Imperial space. Planets went dark, entire systems ceased communications, and Imperial commanders, in their arrogance, dismissed it as another routine orc incursion. After all, frontier worlds were always at risk. It was nothing new. The Imperium had fought orcs 1,000 times before and beaten them just as many. But then, the scale of the attacks became clear. These weren't isolated raids. This was a coordinated strike against multiple sectors at once. Entire star systems were falling before the Imperium could even react. The first real warning came when the orcs attacked Artamantua. At first, it seemed like a routine conflict. Another orc horde, another brutal battle that the Imperial Fists, one of the Emperor's most disciplined Space Marine chapters, would handle with ease. But what happened next sent shockwaves through the Imperium. The orcs that landed weren't just strong. They were monstrous, larger than anything the Astartes had ever seen. They fought with an unnatural level of discipline, shrugging off bolter fire like it was nothing. Even the Imperial Fists, veterans of countless wars, found themselves struggling against an enemy that shouldn't have been this powerful. Then the unimaginable happened. The Imperial Fists were slaughtered. Not just beaten, not just forced, into retreat. They were wiped out. A full company of the Emperor's finest warriors, erased from existence by an orc force that shouldn't have been able to do that. And that was when the Imperium realized this wasn't just another orc invasion. This was something else, something worse. But the worst was yet to come. While the Imperium was still scrambling to understand what had happened at Artamantua, the beast's true war machine roared to life. The orcs weren't just hitting random planets, they were striking key strategic locations. They weren't just looting and burning like usual, they were capturing territory, fortifying positions, and this is the part that still baffles historians, building. The beast's forces weren't just mindlessly pillaging, they were expanding their empire. The real moment of horror came when the beast launched his fleets against the Imperium's heart, Terra itself. It was unthinkable. The Sol system, the cradle of humanity, had been fortified for 10,000 years. No one, not even the traitor legions of the Horus heresy, had dared to attack it since the Emperor himself had walked among men. And yet, here came the beast, sending orc warships straight into Imperial space, bypassing defenses like they were nothing. This wasn't just another orc raid. This was a declaration of war against the entire Imperium. For the first time in millennia, humanity faced an enemy that wasn't just trying to fight them, it was trying to replace them. The beast wasn't just here to burn and loot. He was here to conquer, to rule. And for the first time in history, the Imperium wasn't sure it could stop him. The fall of the Imperium's worlds was not just a series of defeats. It was an unstoppable avalanche, a relentless march of destruction that shattered the belief that humanity was untouchable. One by one, entire planets, fortress worlds, and key strategic locations fell, and with each loss, the realization sank deeper. This wasn't a war they could easily win. This was a survival at its most desperate. The first worlds to be consumed by the beast's were the border planets, the ones furthest from Terra's influence. Imperial commanders initially thought this was a typical orc incursion, brutal but manageable. They deployed Astra Militarum regiments, sent Astartes strike teams, reinforced defenses. But nothing worked. The orcs weren't just overwhelming in numbers. They were precise, calculated, and monstrously powerful. The worlds that fell weren't just looted and left to burn like in past wars. The beasts' forces didn't just leave ruin in their wake. They took over, built upon what was left, and turned entire planets into orc-controlled war factories. The industrial powerhouse of Goth saw one of the most horrifying sieges in the history of the Imperium. Its defenders, numbering in the billions, stood behind walls that had held against Xenos and traitors alike for millennia. It should have been impenetrable, but against the beast it was nothing more than an inconvenience. The orcs came in numbers beyond comprehension, their war machines outmatching even the mighty titans of the Adeptus Mechanicus. It wasn't just a slaughter, it was a complete restructuring of warfare. The defenders held out as long as they could, but when the orcs breached the last defensive lines, it wasn't just a horde charging in with axes and choppas. It was an organized extermination. Then there was Prax, a world that had once been a staging ground for countless Imperial campaigns. Its defensive fleets were some of the strongest outside of the Segmentum Solar. It had a Titan Legion, battle-hardened Astartes, and an entire sector's worth of Astra Militarum regiments. It should have lasted for decades, maybe even centuries. It fell in a week. The orc ships were larger than anything the defenders had ever seen. Cities were wiped off the map in seconds, and even the mighty war engines of the Mechanicus were torn apart like toys. The defenders were not just losing, they were being erased. The real horror set in when the orcs didn't stop. Most of the time, orc invasions lose momentum as the hordes fracture and warbands start fighting amongst themselves. That was the pattern the Imperium had come to expect. But this time, the momentum never slowed. The beast's forces didn't turn on each other. They didn't splinter into countless rival warbands. They kept advancing, pushing further and further into Imperial space, swallowing up entire systems with a discipline and coordination that no one thought orcs were capable of. Some historians believe that if the Imperium had reacted faster, they could have contained the threat before it spread too far. But the problem wasn't just military, it was arrogance. The High Lords of Terra, the bureaucrats and strategists who held humanity's fate in their hands, refused to believe that the orcs could be anything more than a temporary nuisance. Even as reports flooded in, even as entire sectors were falling, silent, they hesitated. They debated, argued, refused to commit their full strength until it was far too late. By the time they understood the scale of the invasion, the beast's empire stretched across multiple sectors. Planets that had once been Imperial bastions now flew orc banners. What were once hive cities filled with billions of Imperial citizens had become factories of war, churning out weapons and ships for a war effort unlike any before. And the worst part? There was no sign that the orcs were slowing down. The Imperium had lost countless worlds, trillions of lives, and some of its finest warriors. But the beast wasn't done. He had set his sights on something far greater, something no orc had ever dared to claim. The heart of humanity itself. The Imperium is vast, ancient, and powerful, but it's also slow, bloated, and weighed down by its own bureaucracy. When the beast's Wah erupted across the stars, the Imperium should have responded with overwhelming force. It should have crushed the invasion before it ever became a true threat. But it didn't, and the reason why is as tragic as it is infuriating. At its core, the Imperium is a machine built for war, but it's a machine that's rusted over the millennia. The Adeptus Administratum, the great bureaucracy that governs humanity, is so massive and convoluted that by the time a single order is processed, entire worlds can already be lost. When the first reports of the beast's invasion arrived, they were treated as nothing more than another orc incursion, just another frontier war that local forces would handle. No one in power recognized the scale of the threat, or worse, they did, but they refused to believe it. The High Lords of Terra, the rulers of the Imperium, were too caught up in their own politics. Every decision had to be debated, every action scrutinized. Who would take command? How much of the Imperium's forces should be committed? Should they wait for more information? These were the kinds of questions they wasted precious time on while entire sectors burned. By the time they finally understood what they were dealing with, the beast had already secured a foothold that should have been impossible for orcs. Then there was the issue of the Imperial military itself. The Astra Militarum, the massive galaxy-spanning Imperial Guard, was built to fight wars of attrition. Against chaos, against tyrannids, against rebellions and insurrections, they were an unstoppable wall of steel and flesh. But against the beast, against an orc empire that fought with actual strategy and coordination, they were outmatched at every turn. Standard battle doctrines fell apart. Defensive lines crumbled before the sheer scale of the orc onslaught. Even when reinforcements arrived, they were often too late to make a difference. And then there were the Astartes, the mighty space marines, the Emperor's angels of death, the most elite warriors humanity had ever created. If anyone could have stopped the beast, it should have been them, but even they weren't enough. The truth is, the Astartes were simply too few. The Imperium's greatest warriors are spread thin across the galaxy, and there were never enough of them to deal with a threat of this magnitude. Even worse, the first Space Marine forces that engaged the beast's armies were slaughtered. The Imperial Fists, the very chapter that had once stood beside Rogel Dorn in defense of Terra itself, were nearly wiped out in the opening battles. That loss alone sent shockwaves through the Imperium. If even the Sons of Dorn couldn't hold back the orcs, what chance did anyone else have? There's another theory that gets thrown around, one that makes this whole disaster even worse. Some believe that the Imperium didn't just fail to act fast enough, they actively underestimated the beast because they refused to believe orcs could be a real threat. It had been 10,000 years since the Great Crusade, since the Emperor had led humanity in its golden age of conquest. The Imperium had become arrogant, dismissing the orcs as little more than a nuisance. They thought of them as mindless barbarians, incapable of real strategy, incapable of ever posing a true existential threat. The beast proved them wrong in the most brutal way possible. But maybe the most tragic part of all this is that it wasn't just incompetence or arrogance that slowed the Imperium down. It was the sheer scale of the galaxy itself. When a crisis like this begins, mobilizing the full force of humanity takes time. Warp travel is unreliable, communication is slow, and even the fastest response fleets can take months or even years to reach the front lines. By the time the Imperium was ready to fight back, the beast had already rewritten the rules of the war. And yet, despite all this, the Imperium wasn't broken. Not yet. There was still hope, still a chance to turn the tide. But with every passing day, the beast grew stronger, and the Imperium fell further into chaos. If they didn't find a way to stop him soon, it wouldn't just be another war. It would be the end of humanity itself. There was a moment, a single, terrifying moment, when it truly felt like this was it. The Imperium, the galaxy-spanning empire that had withstood the Horus Heresy, the Great Rift, and countless other existential threats, was on the brink of annihilation. This wasn't just another war. This wasn't another crusade or rebellion. This was survival at its most desperate. The beast wasn't just winning. He had already won. His forces had carved through Imperial space with terrifying efficiency, claiming entire sectors as his own. The Sol system, the very heart of humanity, was under siege. Orcs had done the impossible. They weren't just raiding. They weren't just pillaging. They had reached the doorstep of Terra itself. And for the first time since the days of Horus, it seemed like the throne world might fall. This was the moment when all the old strategies, all the doctrines, all the supposed might of the Imperium failed. Nothing worked. The Astra Militarum had thrown entire armies into the meat grinder, only for them to be swept aside like they were nothing. Space Marines had launched desperate counterattacks, only to be broken and cast aside. The Adeptus Mechanicus had tried to match the orcs in firepower, but the beast's war machines were too many, too powerful, too advanced. Every attempt to turn the tide had failed. What made it so much worse was the sheer scale of the Ork war effort. These weren't just random war bands following some crazed warlord. This was an empire. The beast had industrialized war itself, turning captured worlds into factory planets dedicated solely to pumping out more and more ships, weapons, and warriors. The longer the war dragged on, the stronger the Orks became. It was a nightmare scenario. The Imperium was bleeding resources, its best warriors were dying, and the Orks were only growing more powerful. Some historians argue that, at this moment, the beast could have finished the job. If he had pressed the attack, if he had launched his full might against Terra, he might have ended the Imperium right then and there. The High Lords of Terra were in disarray. The Imperial fists were shattered. The greatest fleets of the Imperium were either destroyed or scattered. All it would have taken was one final push, one last great wave of destruction, and humanity's dominion over the stars would have been over. So why didn't he? Why didn't the beast strike the final blow when he had the chance? Some say it was arrogance, that he thought the war was already won, and that humanity would crumble without him needing to waste any more of his forces. Others argue that, despite everything, Orks still craved the fight more than the victory itself. The beast may have wanted the war to continue, to drag out the suffering, to enjoy the sheer thrill of watching the Imperium struggle. But then, there's the most unsettling theory. What if he wasn't done building? What if the Orks weren't just attacking? They were constructing something. The beast's forces had already demonstrated a level of technological capability that no one thought possible for Orks. They had created weapons that could challenge the Imperium's strongest defenses, ships that could rival even the might of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Some believe that the beast wasn't just waging war. He was creating something even worse, something that could have reshaped the galaxy itself. Whatever the truth, this was the darkest moment of the war. For the first time, it wasn't clear if the Imperium would survive. The beast had already shattered the idea that Orks were nothing more than disorganized brutes. He had already changed the rules of war, and now he stood on the edge of total victory. But then, something shifted. The Imperium, broken and bleeding, still had one last fight left in it. And though they didn't know it yet, the tide was about to turn. The beast had made one mistake, and soon humanity would find a way to exploit it. When all seemed lost, when the Imperium was teetering on the edge of annihilation, something changed. It wasn't some grand resurgence, some overwhelming counterattack that suddenly reversed the tide. No, the moment that turned the war wasn't born from sheer force. It was born from desperation, from the realization that fighting the beast the same way they had fought Orks before would only lead to extinction. The Imperium had to adapt, and for a regime as bloated and stubborn as this one, that was no small feat. The first real breakthrough came from understanding the nature of the beast himself. Up until now, the Imperium had been fighting Orks the way they always had, targeting war bands, smashing strongholds, grinding them down in long, bloody campaigns. But the beast wasn't just a warlord. He wasn't just the head of an invasion. He was the invasion. Everything from the coordination of his forces to the discipline of his warriors seemed to stem from him. The Orks weren't just following a leader. They were following a force of nature. And that meant something terrifying, but also something vital. If the beast fell, his empire might crumble with him. This was when the Imperium survivors, those who still had the will to fight, began shifting their focus. Instead of trying to push back the tide, they started looking for ways to cut off its head. The plan wasn't to reclaim lost worlds. It wasn't to hold the line anymore. It was to assassinate a being that seemed almost godlike in his power. But how do you kill something that strong? That was the question that haunted Imperial commanders, Space Marine leaders, and even the High Lords of Terra. The answer, as it turned out, was in the past. During the Horus Heresy, the Imperium had faced traitors who had seemed unstoppable. Primarchs, Astartes legions, forces blessed by the warp itself. And the only way to win those battles wasn't through sheer firepower. It was through precise, brutal, targeted strikes. The Sons of Horus weren't broken by a million guardsmen storming their fortresses. They were broken when their leadership crumbled, when the head of the snake was cut off. That was the approach the Imperium would take now. This was the moment when the Imperium stopped fighting like an empire and started fighting like survivors. It was the moment when they realized they couldn't beat the beast in open war. They had to strike at his heart, at his very essence. And so the greatest hunters in the Imperium were sent forth, not armies but specialists, warriors who could do the impossible. There was also another key discovery, one that came almost by accident. Orc society, for all its violence and brutality, was still held together by belief. Orcs didn't just fight for their warlords. They fought because they knew their warlords were the strongest, the most unkillable. And the beast, he was the ultimate symbol of that belief. But what if the Imperium could break that belief? What if they could shatter the myth of the beast, prove to the orcs that even he could die? Some scholars later argued that this was the real turning point of the war, not just the assassinations, not just the targeted strikes, but the psychological war that followed. Orcs are powerful, but they're also creatures of momentum. The stronger their leader, the stronger they all become. But if that leader falters, if that sense of invincibility cracks even slightly, the whole structure starts to break apart. And so the Imperium's counteroffensive wasn't about reclaiming territory. It was about striking where it mattered. It was about sending the best of the best, the last warriors humanity had left, to do the impossible. It was a suicide mission, a desperate gamble. But in the end, it was the only move left. The war had changed. No longer was it about survival. Now, it was about the hunt. And for the first time since the war began, the beast, we had something to fear. The death of the beast wasn't just a victory. It was an impossible feat, a battle that defied all logic, all expectation. Killing an orc war boss is one thing. Killing the beast, a being so powerful, so massive that he could have been mistaken for a living god? That was something else entirely. By this point, the Imperium had already realized that a conventional war was unwinnable. Every battle they fought only strengthened the orcs. Every delay allowed the beast's empire to grow. The solution wasn't reclaiming lost worlds or breaking through orc strongholds. It was cutting off the head of the entire Wak. The Imperium's forces were shattered, their morale nearly broken, but there was one last play left on the board. The final assault was led by an unlikely mix of warriors. Astartes, of course, what was left of the Imperial fists, still reeling from their near annihilation earlier in the war. There were also agents of the Officio Assassinorum, whose entire existence revolved around eliminating high-value targets, and inquisitors who had seen firsthand that the beast wasn't just a war boss, he was a phenomenon. And then there were the last surviving Imperial commanders, the ones who had fought against the beast long enough to understand his strength, his weaknesses, and most importantly, his pride. The plan was simple in theory, but near impossible in execution. The Imperium had to strike at the heart of the beast's empire, his throne world, his capital, the very seat of his impossible orc dominion. This wasn't just an orc-infested planet. It was a fortress, an industrial nightmare pumping out war machines on a scale that dwarfed anything humanity had ever built. Assaulting it was suicide. But what choice did they have? The battle itself was beyond apocalyptic. War bands numbering in the trillions clashed with the last remnants of the Imperium's finest warriors. Titans, battle barges, entire fleets fought tooth and nail just to secure a path for the strike teams to reach their target. But no one, not even the Space Marines, was prepared for the sight of the beast himself. Descriptions of him vary, but all agree on one thing. He wasn't just big. He was monstrous. More than a war boss, more than a knob, more than anything the orcs had ever produced. Some say he was as large as a titan, a walking avatar of orc brutality made flesh. His armor was less a suit and more a walking fortress, an amalgamation of the greatest weapons the orcs had ever scavenged or built. And his presence alone? It made the air thrum with sheer orcish belief. He wasn't just leading this war, he was the war. So how do you kill something like that? The battle was unlike anything in history. The first attempt to take him down failed spectacularly. The initial kill team, led by the finest warriors of the Adeptus Astartes, barely scratched him. The beast ripped through Space Marines as if they were mere guardsmen, breaking them apart with his bare hands, his sheer size making even the most elite warriors of humanity look insignificant. It was a massacre. But here's the thing about the Imperium. It doesn't stop. No matter how many are lost, no matter how grim the odds, there is always another blade, another bolter, another warrior ready to throw themselves into the fire. And so, when the first kill team failed, the next one followed. And the next, and the next. The beast may have been unstoppable, but even the strongest enemy can be worn down. The final blow, the one that finally put an end to the nightmare, came from an unexpected source, Courland, the last Imperial Fist. He wasn't just any Space Marine. He was the sole survivor of his chapter's near destruction at the hands of the beast's forces. He had seen firsthand what this orc could do, and he knew that if humanity had any chance of surviving, he had to finish what his fallen brothers could not. The fight between Courland and the beast was the stuff of legends. A single Space Marine, clad in the colors of the shattered Imperial fists, standing against a creature that had brought the Imperium to its knees. It wasn't a fair fight. Courland knew he wouldn't leave that battlefield alive, but he also knew that he didn't need to win. He just needed to land one fatal strike. In the end, it wasn't strength that won the day. It wasn't brute force. It was sheer, unwavering determination. Courland fought with the fury of his entire fallen chapter, delivering a final decisive attack that brought the beast crashing down. Some say it was a moment of divine intervention, that the Emperor himself guided Courland's strike. Others believe that the beast, in his arrogance, simply underestimated the sheer, unbreakable will of an Imperial warrior. Whatever the truth, the beast fell, and with him, his entire empire began to crumble. But here's the part that still haunts historians and orc warbands alike. The beast wasn't alone. When the Imperium thought the war was over, when they believed they had finally broken the back of the Wah, they discovered something chilling. There wasn't just one beast. There were others. The Imperium had won, but the cost was unimaginable. And the greatest question remained unanswered. Was the beast truly gone, or was he just the first of something far worse? When the beast finally fell, it should have been a moment of pure triumph. The Imperium had faced the unthinkable, had been brought to its knees, and yet, against all odds, it had survived. But as the dust settled and the battlefields fell silent, one truth became painfully clear. This was not a victory to celebrate. This was survival, nothing more, and the scars it left behind would never fully heal. The Imperium was in ruins. Entire sectors were gone, reduced to nothing more than orc-infested wastelands or lifeless husks drifting through the void. Hive worlds that had once held billions were now little more than charred corpses of industry, stripped clean by the orcs' insatiable hunger for war. Countless regiments of the Astra Militarum had been wiped from existence. Entire Space Marine chapters had been shattered beyond repair. Even Terra itself had come closer to destruction than at any point since the Horus Heresy. But the damage wasn't just physical. The war had exposed a terrifying truth about the Imperium, its weakness. For all its power, for all its legions and fleets, it had been caught off guard. It had been slow, blind, crippled by its own bureaucracy. The High Lords of Terra had hesitated when they should have acted. They had argued while entire systems burned. And when the Imperium needed a leader, a single unifying force to rally behind, there was nothing. The Emperor remained silent on his golden throne. The Primarchs were gone. The Imperium had survived not because of its leadership, but despite it. In response, the Imperium had to change, at least for a while. The shattered remnants of the Imperial fists reformed into something new, something more aggressive. The Adeptus Astartes, which had once been spread thin, began adapting, learning from the horrors of the war. The Inquisition, more powerful than ever, ensured that something like this could never happen again, though their methods were brutal even by Imperial standards. The Imperium had always been a brutal machine, but after the Beast, it became something even darker. And then there were the Orks. The death of the Beast should have meant the end of his empire, and in many ways it did. Without his unifying presence, the Ork Empire collapsed into infighting, breaking apart into the chaotic mess that the Imperium was used to dealing with. Without their unkillable warlord, the Orks lost their coordination, their terrifying organization. But that didn't mean they were gone. If anything, they had been changed. For the first time in recorded history, the Orks had seen what true power looked like. They had seen an Ork rise to a level beyond even the mightiest. War bosses had watched as one of their own had nearly conquered the stars. And if it happened once, it could happen again. That was the real nightmare that lingered in the minds of Imperial strategists. The Beast had proven that the Orks weren't just a nuisance, weren't just a rabble of war bands doomed to endless infighting. If the right Ork rose at the right time, they could become something more. They could become an existential threat unlike anything humanity had ever faced. And then there was the question no one in the Imperium wanted to ask. Was the Beast truly gone? The Imperium had thought they had won. They had thought they had cut off the head of the snake. But the truth was even more horrifying. There wasn't just one Beast. There were multiple. One had fallen, but there were others waiting in the shadows, rising to take his place. This wasn't just the story of a single Ork Warlord. It was something bigger, something deeper, something that hinted at a far more terrifying possibility. Some scholars believe that the Beast was proof of something far worse, that Orks weren't just evolving, but that they were meant to evolve. That somewhere, deep in their genetic code, they held the potential to produce warlords of unimaginable power when the time was right. That the Beast wasn't an anomaly, but a glimpse into what Orks could become when their reached critical mass. The Imperium had survived, but it had barely survived. And as the centuries dragged on, as the war with chaos, tyrannids, and countless other threats consumed its attention, one question remained unanswered. If the Beast could rise once, then what was stopping another from rising again? And next time, would the Imperium be ready? Or would it finally fall? The Imperium declared victory after the Beast fell. The High Lords of Terra, the shattered remnants of the Imperial fists, and the surviving commanders of the war all hailed it as one of the greatest triumphs in human history. The Orks were broken, their empire collapsed, and the greatest war boss to ever exist was dead. But was it truly a victory? Or was it just survival dressed up as triumph? Because if you really step back and look at what happened, the war against the Beast was something far worse than anyone is willing to admit. It wasn't a war that the Imperium won. It was a disaster that they barely endured. The Imperium didn't defeat the Beast's empire through strength, strategy, or superior firepower. It won because it found a weakness, an exploit that let them cut off the head of the snake before it was too late. And that should terrify anyone who understands Orks, because for all their brutality and savagery, for all their seeming chaos, Orks learn. They adapt. And worst of all, they remember. Think about it. The Orks who followed the Beast saw something that no other greenskins in history had ever seen: true power. They saw a leader rise above the mindless infighting that usually tears Ork warbands apart. They saw an empire, a working civilization in the only way Orks could ever conceive one, stretching across the stars. They saw something that had never existed before. And sure, the beast died. Sure, the Imperium struck a killing blow, but that knowledge, that sheer possibility, didn't die with him. It spread, because orcs don't operate like humans. They don't need books, data, or archives. Their knowledge is something stranger, something woven into their very biology. The idea of what the beast achieved, of what he proved orcs could be, was burned into the subconscious of the entire species. And it's only a matter of time before another orc, somewhere in the galaxy, starts putting the pieces together again. And here's where things get truly unsettling. After the war, the Imperium didn't actually crush the orcs. They didn't wipe them out. They didn't reclaim all of the lost territory. There were still remnants of the beast's empire scattered across the stars, orc enclaves that had once been part of his great dominion. And worse, there were other beasts. The Imperium had assumed it was dealing with just one warlord, just one singular monster leading the charge. But the truth was far worse. There were many. In the aftermath of the war, the Imperium discovered that multiple beasts had risen, each leading their own armies, each potentially as dangerous as the first. It wasn't just about stopping a single Ork Warlord. It was about preventing an entirely new era of orc dominance from taking shape. And the truth is, the Imperium barely succeeded. They killed the beast, but they only just managed to prevent the rest of his kind from picking up where he left off. So, what happens next? The Imperium rebuilt, as it always does. The broken chapters of the Astartes were reforged, the defenses of key worlds were strengthened, and countless new military campaigns were launched to reclaim lost systems. But did the Imperium actually learn anything? Did it truly prepare for the next? Time? Because if history has taught us anything, it's that the Imperium never learns. It fights, it suffers, it survives, but it doesn't change. The next time another beast rises, and make no mistake, it will happen, the Imperium will face the same problem again. It will hesitate, it will debate, it will ignore the early warnings until it is too late. And next time, there may not be an Imperial fist like Courland to deliver the killing blow. Next time, the orcs may not make the same mistakes. And next time, the beast may actually finish what he started. One of the most chilling possibilities to come out of the beast's rise isn't just what he accomplished, it's why he existed in the first place. Because if you take a step back and really think about it, he wasn't just another Ork Warlord. He wasn't just some freakishly big war boss who got lucky. He was something new, something different. And that raises a terrifying question. Was the beast an accident of nature, or was he the first glimpse of what orcs are meant to become? For millennia, the Imperium has classified orcs as a horde species, brutal, warlike, and primitive in their organization. They were considered dangerous, of course, but manageable. Even when Ork Wars surged through the stars, they always burned out eventually. The orcs would either fight amongst themselves, get wiped out, or simply lose momentum as their warbands scattered. That's how it had always worked. But the beast broke that pattern completely. His orcs were different. They were smarter, more coordinated, more advanced. They fought in ways no orc had before. They built cities, fortifications, and war factories that rivaled those of the Mechanicus. Their fleets were organized into disciplined battle formations. Even their weapons seemed stronger, their tactics more refined. This wasn't just a bigger, meaner Wa. This was an orc empire evolving into something the Imperium had never seen before. And if they did it once, they can do it again. Some scholars in the Imperium have quietly speculated that orcs are not as static as humanity believes, that they aren't just an endless tide of war-hungry brutes doomed to repeat the same cycles forever. Instead, they argue that orcs adapt, that their collective psychic field doesn't just shape reality, it shapes them. That as the galaxy itself changes, so too do the orcs, responding to threats, evolving to meet new challenges, and producing leaders capable of taking them to even greater heights. The beast could have been the first true sign of this process. a natural response to the sheer scale of the Imperium, a reaction to the galaxy-spanning might of humanity. The Orks had always been seen as nothing more than a chaotic force of destruction, but what if that was just a phase? What if the beast was proof that Orks, when given enough time and numbers, can become something more, something terrifyingly structured, something capable of lasting dominion? Some even believe that this might be a remnant of their ancient origins. The Old Ones, the mysterious creators of many of the galaxy's oldest species, supposedly engineered the Orks, or at least their ancestors, as a weapon to fight in the war in heaven against the Necrons. But what if Orks were never meant to remain the scattered warbands they are today? What if they were meant to evolve into something greater, into a species that could unify and challenge even the mightiest empires? Of course, the Imperium would never admit this. Officially, Orks are a threat to be contained, not a species with untapped potential. But among Inquisitors, among the highest levels of the Adeptus Mechanicus, among the few who truly understand what the beast represented, the fear remains. If the Orks could produce a leader like him once, there is no reason they can't do it again. And next time, the Imperium may not be lucky enough to stop it. Looking back on the war against the beast, it's hard to fully grasp just how close the Imperium came. To utter destruction. This wasn't just another Ork invasion, another mindless wah that could be crushed through sheer attrition. This was something else, something worse. The beast wasn't just a war boss. He was the most terrifying manifestation of Ork potential the galaxy had ever seen. And the worst part? He almost won. The Imperium had faced countless existential threats before: Horus and his traitor legions, the Great Rift, the awakening of the Necrons, the endless hunger of the Tyranids. But the beast was different. He wasn't blessed by the Chaos Gods, he wasn't an ancient horror from before humanity's time, and he wasn't a xeno-species on the rise. He was an Ork, a race the Imperium had been fighting for millennia, a race they thought they understood, a race they had written off as little more than a constant nuisance. And yet, he did what even the greatest traitor legions had failed to do. He brought the Imperium to its knees. The sheer scale of his war effort still seems impossible. He didn't just command a Wah, he ruled an empire. He didn't just build war machines, he created fleets that could challenge the might of the Mechanicus. His Orks didn't just fight in a frenzied horde, they fought with discipline, with purpose, with terrifying efficiency. And most chilling of all, he didn't just attack the Imperium, he nearly replaced it. His forces seized worlds, repurposed them, and built something greater. He was the first Ork to truly create a galactic power rivaling the Imperium, and that's why his existence is so terrifying, because if it happened once, it can happen again. This is the question that haunts Imperial strategists, Inquisitors, and even the most hardened Astartes commanders. Was the beast a one-time anomaly, some freak of Ork evolution that will never be repeated? Or was he a warning? A glimpse into what the Orks could truly become if they ever stop fighting each other long enough to unite under a leader like him? Some believe it's inevitable, that Orks, as a species, are capable of producing beings like the beast when their numbers and their psychic energy reach a critical mass, that the more the Imperium fights them, the more they grow, and the more likely it is that another beast will emerge. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually. Others argue that the beast was unique, that whatever convergence of circumstances allowed him to rise, whether it was sheer luck, some forgotten element of Ork history, or even the will of Gork and Mork themselves, won't be repeated. That the Orks are simply too chaotic, too prone to self-destruction for something like his empire to ever truly form again. That no matter how many Orks rise, they will always tear each other apart before they can reach his level. But then, there's the unsettling truth that the Imperium refuses to acknowledge. The Orks aren't gone. They were never gone. Their numbers have only grown since the days of the beast. And though they are scattered, though they continue their endless infighting, the possibility remains. The potential remains. So what happens if another beast rises? What happens if another Ork Warlord, just as massive, just as cunning, just as unstoppable, emerges once more? Would the Imperium be ready this time? Or would it finally fall? No one knows the answer. But one thing is certain. If the beast nearly ended the Imperium once, another like him will try again. And next time, humanity might not be so lucky.